Now, settle in close, friend. What I'm fixin' to tell you happened in a little town called Cedar Ridge, back when the West was still wild and mercy was scarcer than water in August. Pull up that chair a bit closer to the fire, because this here's a story that needs telling proper. This is a tale about shame and the man who wouldn't let it stand. But it's also about something else, about how a town can lose its soul one whisper at a time, and how it takes just one voice to call it back home. The year was 1878, and Cedar Ridge sat like a weathered saddle in a valley between the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and the vast Colorado Plains. It was the kind of place that existed because of three things: silver in the nearby hills, water from Willow Creek that ran year-round, and the railroad that came through twice a week, carrying dreams and disappointments in equal measure. Now, Cedar Ridge wasn't much to look at. Maybe 200 souls on a good Sunday, scattered among wooden buildings that creaked in the mountain wind. Main Street was nothing but dirt and hope, lined with Fletcher's General Store, the Silver Dollar Saloon, Murphy's blacksmith shop, and the Cedar Ridge Bank, which was barely bigger than a horse stall but acted important on account of all the mining money that flowed through it. But the real heart of Cedar Ridge, the place that beat with the rhythm of the town's moral pulse, was the whitewashed church at the end of Main Street. Every Sunday morning, folks would gather there like vultures to a carcass, dressed in their finest clothes but often carrying their ugliest thoughts. On this particular morning in late September, when the aspen leaves were turning gold and the first bite of winter was sneaking down from the peaks, the buzzards had their eyes on one woman. Mary Collins, widow of 6 months. Her husband Thomas had died in a cave-in up at the Lucky Strike mine, leaving her with nothing but debts that seemed to grow like weeds, and a small boy named Jamie, who had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Mary was 32 years old, which in those days meant she was still young enough to turn heads, but old enough to know the weight of the world. She had that kind of beauty that made other women count their jewelry twice and their husbands' glances 3 times. Chestnut hair that caught the light like polished copper, green eyes that could look right through a lie, and hands that told the story of honest work, calloused from washing clothes, scarred from mending tears, but still gentle enough to soothe a child's fevered brow. Thomas Collins had been a good man, the kind who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it, even if it was the only shirt he owned. He'd worked the mines, not because he loved the darkness and danger, but because it was honest work that could feed his family. When the mine took him, it left Mary with Jamie, a mountain of unpaid bills, and a town full of folks who thought they knew what a widow should do with her grief. She'd been coming to church faithful as sunrise, same as she had when Thomas was alive. Every Sunday morning, she'd walk that dusty half-mile from her little cabin on the outskirts of town, holding Jamie's hand and carrying what remained of her faith like a candle in a windstorm. But now the whispers followed her like smoke from a poorly tended fire. "Saw her talking to that traveling merchant again yesterday," Mrs. Henderson would mutter to Mrs. Patterson as they arranged their skirts in the church pews. "And her wearing that dress that shows her ankles." "Shameful," Mrs. Patterson would whisper back, though the truth was Mary only owned 3 dresses, and 2 were so patched they looked like quilts. "I heard she was at the Silver Dollar last Thursday evening," added Mrs. Thornton, whose husband drank enough for 3 men, but somehow that never made it into the Sunday gossip. The truth was simpler and sadder than their whispers suggested. Mary had been taking in washing and mending just to keep food on Jamie's table and a roof over their heads. She'd wash clothes down at Willow Creek when the weather was fair, her hands red and raw from the lye soap and cold water. When winter came, she'd heat water on her wood stove and scrub in a wash basin that Thomas had made for her their first year of marriage. The traveling merchant they'd seen her talking to. He was bringing her a bundle of shirts that needed mending, work that would earn her 50 cents if she was lucky. The Silver Dollar visit. She'd gone to collect laundry from some of the cowboys who stayed in the rooms above the saloon. Nothing more scandalous than that, but in a town like Cedar Ridge, a woman's desperation looks an awful lot like sin to folks who've forgotten what hunger feels like. Young Jamie Collins was 6 years old, with his father's sandy hair and a gap-toothed smile that could charm the birds from the trees. He didn't understand why people looked at his ma different now, why the other children sometimes weren't allowed to play with him, why his mother sometimes stared out the window at night with tears she thought he couldn't see. The boy had started asking questions that cut Mary deeper than any gossip. "Mom, why don't folks talk to us after church no more? And did Pa do something wrong before he died?" Questions that had no good answers, at least none that a 6-year-old could understand. Mary had tried to explain it once, sitting on the edge of his bed by the light of their single oil lamp. "Some people," she'd said, choosing her words careful as picking wild flowers, "think they know things about us that ain't true. But we know who we are, Jamie. We know Pa was a good man, and we're going to keep being good people, no matter what anybody says." But keeping faith gets harder when you're surrounded by doubt, and Mary Elizabeth Collins was starting to feel the weight of that particular truth. Now I need to tell you about the man who was watching all this unfold. Sitting in the very back of that church, almost invisible in the shadows, was a fellow most folks barely noticed. Name was Samuel "Sam" Dakota, though nobody knew if that was his real name or just another story he wore like an old coat. Sam had drifted into Cedar Ridge about 3 months prior, in early June when the mountain wildflowers were blooming and the mining camps were hiring. He'd bought himself a small spread about 5 miles outside town. Nothing fancy, just a cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and enough grazing land for the dozen horses he seemed to know everything about. Sam Dakota was 45 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested he'd lived closer to 60 years' worth of experiences. He stood just over 6 feet tall, built like a man who'd spent his life doing real work. His hair was the color of iron, with threads of silver running through it, and his hands told stories, scars from rope burns, a crooked finger that had been broken and healed wrong, calluses that spoke of years in the saddle. But it was his eyes that set him apart. They were the color of a winter sky, pale blue and distant, but they saw everything. Sam Dakota was the kind of man who could tell you how many horses were in a corral from a quarter-mile away, who could spot a lame animal in a herd of 50, who could read weather patterns like some folks read newspapers. He was also the kind of man who'd learned to make himself invisible when he wanted to be. In church he always took the same spot, last pew on the right side, where the shadows were deepest and the view was clearest. He'd nod politely to folks who acknowledged him, tip his hat to the ladies, but he never lingered for the socializing that happened after services. The townspeople had their theories about Sam Dakota, of course. Some figured him for a former outlaw trying to go straight. Others thought he might be running from something back east. A few of the more romantic-minded ladies whispered that he was probably a heartbroken widower seeking solitude in the mountains. They were all wrong, but they were also all a little bit right. Sam Dakota was indeed running from something, but it wasn't the law or a broken heart that had driven him to Cedar Ridge. It was himself. More specifically, it was the man he'd been for too many years, a man who'd stood by and watched injustice happen because it wasn't his business, wasn't his fight, wasn't his problem. Truth was, Sam had been a lot of things in his 45 years. He'd been a cowhand on ranches from Texas to Montana. He'd been a scout for the army during the Indian campaigns, though he'd never been proud of that particular chapter. He'd been a town marshal in 3 different places, and a federal marshal for the better part of a decade. It was that last job that had nearly broken him. Sam Dakota had spent 10 years chasing killers and thieves across the territories, bringing them back dead or alive as the situation required. He'd been good at it, maybe too good. He could track a man across rock and sand, could outdraw most anyone foolish enough to try him, could read guilt in a man's face from across a crowded saloon. But somewhere along the way, in all that chasing and catching and judging, he'd forgotten something important about being human. He'd forgotten that sometimes the most important thing you can do isn't catching the guilty, it's protecting the innocent. The moment that realization hit him had been in a town called Bitter Creek, New Mexico territory. 2 years before, he'd been tracking a bank robber named Jack Henley, following him into a small community not unlike Cedar Ridge. Henley had been hiding out there for weeks, and the townspeople were protecting him, not because they liked bank robbers, but because Henley had been helping them with their own problems. The town had been under the thumb of a corrupt banker who was foreclosing on every farm and ranch he could get his hands on. Henley had robbed that banker's bank, sure enough, but he'd also been using the money to help families pay their debts, to buy medicine for sick children, to keep the community from falling apart. Sam had done his job. He'd brought Henley in, recovered most of the money, seen justice done according to the law. But 2 months later, he'd heard that Bitter Creek had become a ghost town, its people scattered to the wind after the banker had finished his dirty work. That's when Sam Dakota had learned the difference between justice and righteousness, between following orders and following your conscience. He'd turned in his badge that same week and started drifting, trying to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be for whatever years he had left. Now, sitting in that church pew every Sunday, Sam had been watching Mary Collins carry herself with dignity while the town slowly tried to strip it away from her. He'd watched her work herself near to exhaustion, watched her son's confusion, watched the community that should have been supporting her instead turn their backs. And every week, it got a little harder to stay silent. The thing about Sam Dakota was that he'd developed an eye for reading people, and he could see Mary Collins clear as daylight. She wasn't a woman of loose morals, as the gossip suggested. She was a woman doing whatever honest work she could find to keep her family together. The way she held her boy's hand, the way she kept her chin up despite the whispers, the way she never once asked for charity but worked for every penny she earned. Sam recognized that kind of strength because he'd been married to it once. His own wife, Elizabeth, had died of cholera 6 years back, along with their daughter Sarah. Elizabeth Dakota had been cut from the same cloth as Mary Collins. Proud, hard-working, devoted to her family. If Elizabeth had been left widowed instead of him, she would have done exactly what Mary was doing. She would have worked her hands raw, endured the whispers, and never once compromised her principles. Maybe that's why Sam Dakota felt something stir in his chest every time he watched Mary Collins walk into that church, with her head held high, despite the judgment surrounding her. Maybe that's why he found himself taking longer routes past her cabin, just to make sure she and the boy were all right. Maybe that's why he'd taken to leaving anonymous gifts on her porch, a cord of firewood here, a sack of flour there, always when he knew she wasn't home to refuse them. Sam had been telling himself for weeks that it wasn't his business, that he was just a newcomer who had no right to interfere in the town's affairs. But deep down, he knew he was just doing what he'd always done, finding reasons to stay invisible, to avoid getting involved, to let someone else deal with the hard choices. The hard choice was coming, though. Sam could feel it building like a thunderstorm over the mountains, and he had a feeling that this particular Sunday morning was going to be the day when staying silent would become impossible. Standing at the front of that church was Reverend Hoskins, a man who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge about the same time as Sam, though by a different road and with very different intentions. Reverend Jeremiah Hoskins appeared to be a man of God, with his perfectly groomed beard, his serious demeanor, and his ability to quote scripture with the fluency of a scholar. He was somewhere in his 50s, well-dressed despite the frontier setting, and possessed of the kind of commanding voice that could fill a church or quiet a crowd. The good people of Cedar Ridge had welcomed him with open arms after their previous minister, old Reverend Murphy, had passed away the winter before. They were grateful to have a learned man of the cloth, someone who could bring a bit of civilization and proper moral guidance to their rough-edged community. What they didn't know was that Reverend Jeremiah Hoskins was actually a man named Jerome Haskins, and he'd been running confidence games on frontier towns for the better part of 3 years. His method was simple and effective: arrive in a community that had recently lost their minister, establish himself as a man of God, gain the trust and respect of the townspeople, then disappear with whatever money he could get his hands on. He'd perfected his act in Kansas, refined it in Colorado mining camps, and had been working his way through New Mexico and back north, always staying one step ahead of the law and any awkward questions about his past. Hoskins was smart enough to know that the best con games were built on giving people what they wanted to believe about themselves. Cedar Ridge wanted to believe they were a moral, upstanding community. So he gave them sermons about righteousness and judgment, about the importance of maintaining proper standards in a lawless land. And if those sermons happened to create scapegoats who drew attention away from his own activities, well, that was just good business. He'd had his eye on Mary Collins since the day he'd arrived, not because he believed she was actually guilty of anything. Hoskins was too experienced a con man not to recognize genuine virtue when he saw it, but he also recognized an opportunity when he saw one. A beautiful young widow, struggling financially, forced to interact with men in the course of earning a living. She was perfect for his purposes. If he could paint her as a woman of questionable morals, it would give the congregation something to focus their moral outrage on, while he quietly helped himself to the church's building fund. Moreover, driving Mary out of the community would eliminate a potential witness. Hoskins had noticed that Mary Collins was one of the few people in town who really looked at things, really paid attention. She had the kind of clear-eyed intelligence that might start asking awkward questions if given enough time. So for weeks, Reverend Hoskins had been laying the groundwork, dropping hints about the importance of moral purity, about the dangers of allowing impropriety to take root in a God-fearing community. He'd been carefully cultivating the gossip, encouraging the whispers, feeding the suspicions until they grew into something that could justify public action. This Sunday morning, with the church fund now light by nearly $300 and his bags already packed in case he needed to make a quick departure, Hoskins had decided it was time to make his move. The church bell stopped its tolling, and Reverend Hoskins took his place at the simple wooden pulpit. The congregation settled into their seats with the usual rustle of fabric and whispered conversations. Mary Collins sat in the third pew from the back, as she always did, with Jamie beside her, his legs swinging because his feet didn't quite reach the floor. Sam Dakota watched from his shadowed corner as Hoskins surveyed the congregation with what looked like pastoral concern, but what Sam recognized as something else entirely, the calculating gaze of a predator choosing its moment to strike. "Before we begin today's service," Hoskins said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the small church, "I feel compelled to address certain behaviors that have come to my attention." The church fell silent in that particular way that happens when people sense scandal in the air. Mary's face paled, and she instinctively put a protective arm around Jamie's shoulders. Sam Dakota's jaw tightened. He'd been dreading this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, he felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. "The good book tells us," Hoskins continued, opening his Bible with theatrical precision, "that a woman's virtue is her most precious possession. Proverbs 31 speaks of the virtuous woman, whose price is far above rubies. But what happens when that virtue is questionable?" He paused, letting his words sink in, his eyes scanning the congregation before settling deliberately on Mary. "When a woman of uncertain reputation continues to parade herself before decent folks, we must ask ourselves, what message does this send to our children? What corruption does this bring into our community?" Mary's hands were trembling now, whether from anger or fear. Sam couldn't tell, probably both. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson exchanged meaningful looks. Several other parishioners turned to stare directly at Mary, no longer bothering to disguise their judgment. "I have received reports," Hoskins continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a practiced orator, "of inappropriate associations, of unseemly behavior, of a woman who seems to have forgotten that her husband's grave dirt is barely settled." That last comment hit Mary like a physical blow. She gasped and tears sprang to her eyes. Sam Dakota's hands clenched into fists. "Perhaps," Hoskins said, closing his Bible with a sharp snap. It would be better for all concerned if certain individuals found another place to worship, a place more suited to their particular moral standards. The silence that followed was deafening. Mary sat frozen for a moment, the color draining from her face. Then she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I've done nothing wrong, Reverend," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm just trying to survive." Survival, Mrs. Collins, does not excuse impropriety. A Christian woman finds other ways to provide for herself, ways that don't compromise her reputation or the moral standing of her community. What ways? Mary's voice was rising now. 8 months of frustration and grief, finally breaking through her careful composure. "Tell me, Reverend, what ways? Should I let my son go hungry? Should I let us lose our home? What exactly would you have me do?" "I would have you conduct yourself as a proper Christian woman should, with dignity, with modesty, with appropriate reliance on the charity of the Church rather than other means." "The Church?" Mary's laugh was bitter. "What charity? I've been coming here for 8 years, Reverend. 8 years of tithing, what little we had, of helping with church suppers, of visiting the sick and caring for the elderly. And when Thomas died, when I needed that community I'd helped build, where was it?" Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Some people looked uncomfortable now, perhaps remembering their own lack of action. "Mrs. Collins," Hoskins said, his voice hardening, "your bitterness is unbecoming. Perhaps that attitude is precisely why Christian charity has been difficult to extend in your direction." That's when Mary Collins did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She laughed, not the bitter laugh of before, but a genuine laugh of sudden understanding. "You know what, Reverend? You're absolutely right. My attitude is the problem. My attitude of expecting people who call themselves Christians to act like Christians. My attitude of thinking that a community should help its members in times of need. My attitude of believing that honest work, no matter how humble, is better than false piety." She picked up her reticule and took Jamie's hand. "Come on, son, we're going home." As Mary started to walk toward the door, her head held high despite the tears on her cheeks, Hoskins pressed his advantage. "Let this be a lesson to all," he called after her. "This is what happens when a woman forgets her proper place, when she allows pride to overcome Christian humility. The wages of sin." "Stop." The word cut through the church like a knife blade. Sam Dakota was on his feet, and his voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone turn. For a moment, the only sound in the church was Mary's footsteps, which had stopped at Sam's command. She turned slowly, hope and confusion warring in her face. "Mrs. Collins," Sam said, his voice calm and steady, "would you mind taking your seat again? I believe there are some things that need saying." Mary hesitated, then slowly walked back to her pew, Jamie's hand still clutched in hers. Sam Dakota stepped out of the shadows and into the aisle. As he walked forward, his spurs rang softly against the wooden floor, and for the first time people really looked at him, really saw him. There was something different about Sam Dakota in that moment. The invisible man was gone, replaced by someone who moved with quiet confidence and carried himself with unmistakable authority. "Reverend Hoskins," Sam said, stopping about halfway down the aisle, "before you finish your sermon, I'd like to share something with the congregation. Mr. Dakota, this is highly irregular. I'd like to tell them about Mary Collins." Sam turned to face the congregation, his pale eyes moving from face to face. "Mary Elizabeth Collins, daughter of John and Sarah Mitchell, who farmed 40 acres outside Pueblo before the drought took their crops and their lives. Wife to Thomas Collins for 8 good years. Mother to Jamie Collins, age 6, who's sitting right there trying to understand why grown folks are being cruel to his ma." His voice was growing stronger, more confident, as if years of enforced silence were finally breaking free. Woman who sat by her husband's bedside for 3 days and nights when he took sick with fever 2 winters back, never sleeping, barely eating, just praying and cooling his brow until the fever broke. Sam began walking again, moving slowly down the aisle as he spoke. Woman who brought soup to the Henderson family when they lost their crop to locusts last summer. Woman who sewed burial clothes for old Mrs. Murphy when she passed and refused any payment because she said it was Christian duty. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Woman who's taken in washing and mending for half the families in this church, working her fingers raw because she's too proud to ask for charity and too honest to do anything that ain't earned. Sam stopped beside Mary's pew, his presence suddenly protective. Woman who walks 5 miles to town every day before dawn to collect work, then walks 5 miles home at sunset with her back bent under the weight of other folks' dirty laundry. Woman who patches the same dress 3 times rather than spend money on herself that could buy food for her boy. The church was absolutely silent now. Even Hoskins seemed uncertain how to respond to this unexpected turn. Woman who gives her son the larger portion at every meal and makes do with what's left. Woman who burns old newspapers instead of good firewood to save money, even when the mountain cold makes her hands shake so bad she can barely hold a needle. Sam's voice dropped, becoming more intimate, as if he were sharing secrets. I know these things because I've been watching, not spying, not judging, just watching. The way you watch someone you respect, the way you watch someone who's showing you what real courage looks like. He turned to face Hoskins directly, and now I see a room full of people who call themselves Christians, fixing to cast stones at the most Christian woman among them. Mr. Dakota, Hoskins said, his voice tight with anger, you are out of order. This is neither the time nor the place. When is the time, Reverend? When is it the right time to speak up for someone who can't defend herself? When is it the right place to tell the truth? Sam took another step forward, and something in his posture made Hoskins instinctively step back. See, I've been in a lot of churches, Reverend. From here to California, down to Mexico, up to Montana, preached to by a lot of different ministers, heard a lot of different sermons, and you know what I learned? The congregation was hanging on every word now. A church building don't make a place holy. Fine words don't make a man righteous. Even a preacher's collar don't guarantee he's doing God's work. Sam's voice grew harder. What makes a place holy is how it treats the least among them. What makes a man righteous is standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And what makes someone truly Christian is loving their neighbor instead of judging them. How dare you, Hoskins exploded. How dare you come into this house of God and presume to lecture me about Christian duty? Do you know who I am? Sam's smile was cold and sharp. Matter of fact, Reverend, I do know who you are. Question is, do you know who I am? The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Hoskins' face went pale. Sam reached into his vest and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it he withdrew a badge, tarnished silver with unmistakable authority. Names Samuel J. Dakota, United States Marshal, recently retired, and I've been looking for you for a long time, Jerome. Gasps echoed through the congregation. Mary stared at Sam with amazement, while Hoskins looked like a man who'd just seen his own grave. Jerome Haskins, Sam continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of federal authority, also known as Jeremy Hopkins, Jeremiah Hawkins, and Jerome Hoskins, confidence man and thief, wanted in connection with crimes in Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and now Colorado again. This is preposterous, Hoskins sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Then you won't mind if I wire the authorities in Dodge City. They've been looking for a man matching your description. Something about a church building fund that went missing right around the time their minister disappeared. Sam pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Or maybe you'd prefer to discuss what happened in Silver Creek, Colorado, or Alamosa, Or Las Vegas, New Mexico. You've got quite a trail behind you, Jerome. Same pattern every time. Show up in a town that's lost their preacher. Gain folks' trust with fire and brimstone sermons about moral purity, then disappear with whatever money you can get your hands on. The false reverend's composure was crumbling visibly. How much is missing from the church fund, Jerome? $200? $300? Enough to get you to the next town where you can find another flock to fleece? Sam stepped closer, and his voice became deadly quiet. But this time you made a mistake. This time you decided to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to cover your tracks. This time you picked on someone who couldn't fight back, someone who trusted that a house of God would be a place of sanctuary. He looked around the congregation. This time someone was watching. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for years to come. Jerome Hoskins, the man who'd called himself Reverend Hoskins, made a desperate run for the door, pushing through the startled congregation like a coyote with his tail on fire. But Sam Dakota had been chasing men a lot longer than Hoskins had been running from them. The former marshal moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd done this before, intercepting Hoskins at the church door with an ease that made it look almost casual. There was a brief scuffle, the sound of boots on wooden steps, and then Sam was walking back into the church, adjusting his vest and brushing dust from his sleeves. "He won't be bothering anybody anymore," Sam said simply. "Sheriff's got him in custody, and there'll be a federal marshal here by Wednesday to take him back to Kansas for trial." The congregation sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything they'd just witnessed. But Sam wasn't done, not by a long shot. He walked back to where Mary sat, her face a mixture of amazement, gratitude, and something else, something that looked like the first stirring of hope she'd felt in months. "Mrs. Collins," he said gently, "I owe you an apology." "You owe me." Mary's voice was barely a whisper. "I've been watching you struggle for months, and I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was just a newcomer who had no right to interfere. But the truth is, I was being a coward." He turned to face the congregation again. We all were. The silence in the church was different now, not the expectant hush of people waiting for scandal, but the uncomfortable quiet of people confronting their own failures. "Mary Collins," Sam continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "is not the problem with this community. She's the solution we've been too blind to see." He gestured toward her. "Here's a woman who's faced tragedy, poverty and social ostracism, and she's done it with grace, dignity and an unwavering commitment to doing right by her child. She's worked harder than any two people in this room, asked for less than anyone deserved, and kept her faith when all of us gave her every reason to lose it." Mrs. Henderson was crying now, soft tears of shame rolling down her cheeks. "She's everything we claim to value in this community: hard-working, honest, devoted to family, strong in the face of adversity. And what did we do? We turned our backs on her. We let our fear and suspicion poison our judgment. We let a false preacher manipulate us into abandoning one of our own." Sam's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "But it's not too late. It's never too late to do the right thing, to be the community we claim to be, to show that Christian charity isn't just words we say on Sunday mornings." He looked directly at Mrs. Henderson, then at Mrs. Patterson, then at each face in the congregation. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Henderson stood up, her face streaked with tears. "Mary," she said, her voice shaking, "oh dear Lord, what have we done?" She walked over to Mary's pew and knelt down beside it. "Can you ever forgive us? Can you ever forgive me?" Mary looked at the older woman for a moment, then reached out and took her hands. "There's nothing to forgive, Mrs. Henderson. We all make mistakes." "No," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "This was more than a mistake. This was cruel and wrong, and I'm ashamed of myself." She looked up at the rest of the congregation. "We all should be." One by one, Other members of the congregation began to stand. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "Mary, I've got a farm that could use some help. Paid work, not charity. My wife's been saying for months that she needs help with the household tasks, especially with her arthritis acting up. And I've got mending that needs doing," added Mrs. Thornton. "Real mending, the kind that pays fair wages. The school could use someone to help with the children," offered Miss Sarah, the school teacher. "Someone good with reading and numbers. The pay isn't much, but it's steady." Mary was crying now, but they were different tears than she'd shed earlier. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a burden finally being lifted. "Thank you," she whispered. "All of you, thank you." But Sam Dakota wasn't quite finished. "There's one more thing," he said, and something in his voice made everyone look at him again. He walked over to Mary's pew and, to everyone's surprise, knelt down on one knee beside it, putting himself at eye level with both Mary and Jamie. "Mrs. Collins," he said softly, "Mary, I wonder if you'd allow me to walk you home today." "I'd like that," Mary said, her voice barely audible. "And Jamie," Sam continued, turning to the boy, "I wonder if you might like to see my horses sometime. I've got a mare that's real gentle, perfect for teaching a young man to ride." Jamie's eyes lit up with the first genuine joy anyone had seen from him in months. "Really, Mr. Sam?" "Really, partner." As Sam stood up, Mary caught his hand. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why did you do this?" Sam was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything. "Because somebody needed to," he said finally, "and because sometimes a man gets a second chance to be the person he should have been all along." As they walked out of that church together, Sam, Mary and Jamie, the entire congregation followed them outside. But this time, instead of whispers and judgment, there were offers of help, invitations to dinner, promises of work and friendship and community support. The transformation didn't happen overnight, of course. Cedar Ridge had to learn how to be a real community, how to support each other instead of tearing each other down. But it started that Sunday morning, with one man's decision to speak up and one woman's courage to keep her dignity in the face of injustice. Over the following weeks, Mary Collins became what she'd always been, but what the town had been too blind to see, the heart of Cedar Ridge. Her little cabin became a gathering place where neighbors came for advice, comfort, and Mary's famous apple pie. Her sewing circle grew into a support network for any family facing hard times. Her quiet wisdom and unshakable ethics became the standard by which the community measured itself. And Sam Dakota? Well, Sam discovered that retirement didn't have to mean loneliness, that settling down didn't have to mean settling for less. He found himself spending more and more time at Mary's cabin, helping with repairs, teaching Jamie to ride and rope and whittle, and slowly, carefully courting the woman who'd shown him what real courage looked like. It took 3 months before he worked up the nerve to ask if he could court her properly. It took another month after that before she said yes. Not because she didn't care for him, but because she wanted to be sure that he understood what he was asking for, sure that Jamie would accept him, sure that her heart was ready to love again. The courtship of Sam Dakota and Mary Collins became the stuff of legend in Cedar Ridge. Sam would arrive every Sunday morning to escort Mary and Jamie to church, where they now sat in the front pew as respected members of the community. He'd spend his evenings at their cabin, helping Jamie with his letters and numbers while Mary worked on her sewing. On quiet nights, when Jamie had been tucked into bed, Sam and Mary would sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their losses, their hopes for the future. Mary learned that Sam had grown up on a farm in Missouri, that he'd lost his parents to a fever epidemic when he was barely grown, that he'd married young and loved deeply before cholera took his family from him. Sam learned that Mary had been a teacher before she'd married Thomas, that she could read Latin and do figures better than most men, that she'd always dreamed of seeing the ocean but had never been farther from home than Denver. He learned that she hummed while she worked, that she made the best biscuits in 3 counties, and that she had a laugh that could chase away the darkest thoughts. But mostly, they learned that two people who'd been broken by loss could heal each other, that love didn't have to be young and passionate to be real and lasting. They learned that sometimes the best partnerships are built not on fire and excitement, but on respect, understanding, and the quiet certainty that you've found someone worth building a life with. The proposal came on a snowy evening in February, 6 months after that memorable Sunday morning. Sam had been teaching Jamie to play checkers by the light of the oil lamp while Mary worked on a quilt that she claimed was for someone special's wedding someday. "Mary," Sam said suddenly, setting down a checker piece and turning to face her, "I've got something to ask you." She looked up from her quilting, and something in his voice made her set down her needle. "Jamie," Sam continued, "come here, son, this concerns you too." The boy climbed onto Sam's lap with the easy familiarity of a child who'd found a father figure he could trust. "Mary," Sam began again, his voice steady, but his hands trembling slightly, "I know I'm not the young man you married the first time. I know I come with scars and stories, and probably more baggage than any woman should have to take on. But I also know that I love you, and I love this boy, and I'd be honored to spend whatever years I have left trying to make you both happy." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's ring. It's not fancy, but it's been blessed by love, and I'd like it to be blessed by love again." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Samuel Dakota," she said softly, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am, Mary Elizabeth Collins. I'm asking you to be my wife, and I'm asking Jamie to be my son, and I'm asking if maybe we could be a family." Jamie looked up at Sam with serious eyes. "Would that make you my pa?" "If you'd have me, son, I know I can't replace your real pa, and I wouldn't try, but I'd like to love you like a father should, and protect you, and teach you what I can about being a good man." The boy considered this gravely, then nodded. "I'd like that, Mr. Sam. I think my real pa would like you too." Mary was crying openly now, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it. Yes to being your wife. Yes to being a family. Yes to whatever comes next." The wedding took place on a warm Sunday in April, in the same church where their story had truly begun. The entire town attended, and if there were any dry eyes in the house when Sam Dakota and Mary Collins exchanged vows, nobody admitted to it later. Reverend Murphy's nephew, a young minister fresh from seminary, performed the ceremony. His sermon was simple and heartfelt, focusing on second chances, redemption, and the power of a community to heal itself through love and forgiveness. When Sam slipped his mother's ring onto Mary's finger, he whispered something that only she could hear. "Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to be the man you're supposed to be." When Mary spoke her vows, her voice was clear and strong. "Thank you for speaking my name when I needed to hear it most." The reception was held in the church hall, with food donated by every family in town. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears of joy, and the kind of celebration that happens when a community comes together to honor something precious. But the real celebration happened later, in the quiet of their little cabin, when Sam Dakota officially became Jamie Collins' stepfather and Mary Collins became Mary Dakota, and 3 people who'd been alone found out what it meant to be a family. Years passed, good years filled with the ordinary magic of daily life. Sam's horse ranch prospered, helped by Mary's head for business and Jamie's natural way with animals. Mary started a school in their home, teaching the children of Cedar Ridge not just reading and arithmetic, but the values of kindness, fairness, and standing up for what's right. Jamie grew into a fine young man who combined his father's integrity with his mother's intelligence and Sam's quiet strength. He became a teacher himself eventually, carrying on the tradition of education and moral courage that had shaped his childhood. Sam Dakota never again wore a marshal's badge, but he remained the man people turned to when justice needed serving or truth needed speaking. He served as mayor of Cedar Ridge for 12 years, and under his leadership, the town became known throughout the territory as a place where fairness prevailed and every person was valued. But perhaps the most lasting change was in the church itself. After the scandal of the false reverend, the congregation had learned to look deeper, to question authority when it didn't align with their values, and to remember that true religion was about serving others, not judging them. They established a widow's fund, ensuring that no woman in Mary's situation would ever again face poverty and ostracism. They created a community council that included women as well as men, recognizing that decisions affecting families should involve the voices of those who understood families best. They built a school, a library, and a clinic, understanding that a strong community requires education, knowledge, and care for the sick. Most importantly, they remembered the lesson of that Sunday morning, that sometimes the most Christian thing you can do is stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. On quiet evenings, when Sam and Mary sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, they would sometimes talk about that day in the church, about how close they'd come to missing each other entirely. "What if you hadn't spoken up?" Mary would ask. "What if you hadn't had the courage to keep coming to church despite everything?" Sam would counter. "What if that false preacher had succeeded in driving me out of town? What if I'd stayed in the shadows like I'd been doing for years?" But those were questions without answers, philosophical musings that always ended the same way, with gratitude for the chance they'd been given, for the community they'd helped heal, for the love they'd found when they'd least expected it. 20 years later, when Sam Dakota's hair had gone completely silver and Mary's hands showed the gentle marks of time, they were still sitting on that porch, still watching the sunset, still grateful for the day when a quiet cowboy had found his voice and a shamed widow had found her champion. The story of that Sunday morning had become part of Cedar Ridge's founding mythology, passed down to children and grandchildren as an example of how one person's courage could change everything. But for Sam and Mary, it was simpler than that. It was the story of how they'd found each other. The last thing I need to tell you, friend, is what happened to the real villains of this story. Jerome Haskins was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for fraud and theft. He served his time and, by all accounts, genuinely reformed. He ended up working as a bookkeeper in a mining camp in Nevada, living quietly and honestly under his real name. But the real villains weren't Jerome Haskins or even the gossiping church women. The real villain was silence. The silence of good people who saw injustice and didn't speak up. The silence of a community that forgot its responsibility to care for its own. The silence of fear, prejudice, and moral cowardice. And the hero of our story? Well, there were 3 heroes, actually. Mary Collins Dakota, who showed what dignity and courage looked like in the face of persecution. Jamie Collins Dakota, who reminded the adults around him what innocence and trust looked like. And Sam Dakota, who learned that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent when silence serves evil. That's the story of Cedar Ridge, and how a quiet cowboy taught a whole town the difference between religion and righteousness, between judging and understanding, between fear and love. But more than that, it's a story about the power of speaking up, of using your voice to defend those who can't defend themselves, of remembering that every person has a name, a story, a dignity that deserves protection. Remember that name, Mary Collins. Remember that sometimes all it takes to change the world is one voice willing to say that someone matters, that someone deserves better, that someone's name should be spoken with respect instead of whispered with shame. Because that, friend, is what separates the good folks from the great ones. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of courage. Not the absence of mistakes, but the presence of redemption. Not the absence of silence, but the presence of a voice that's willing to speak truth when truth needs speaking. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that voice is our own.